Good. Well, again, welcome to everyone who's joining this session. Again, I'm Kai Holland, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you quite a bit more than I would like to cram into this time, but I'm really excited to share some thoughts with you about the Alaska that we might imagine, and more particularly the specific steps that we might take to build the Alaska that we want, with a focus on the businesses in the future of the Arctic and how those innovations can have impact. I hope in the course of this talk to address a couple issues. One is the role of researchers in this question about the businesses that will come in the future, and also the process by which we might move forward. There's a lot happening. I hope all of you have been as impressed and sometimes wowed as I have with some of the presentations we've heard over the last day and a half. But I also want to invite you into a thought process about how do we move ahead and increase the velocity of what we can accomplish with this. And then finally, before moving on, I want to also just acknowledge and thank Margot for the activity that she just completed. I'll tell you, as somebody that facilitates groups, stepping in and doing something like she did, of inviting you into a participatory process in the middle of a conference, that's just tough work. And I thought it came off nicely and I enjoyed it. And I also hope, though, that what you got a taste of was the power of beginning to link and leverage some of the assets that we have and what we can accomplish in the future. And I want to come back to that point again. Finally, just as a reminder, Margot and I will both be taking questions at the end of this. So if I do my job well, or if I at least get by, hopefully we'll have the last 5 or 10 minutes for some questions. So if you have some for Margot or for me, we'll be jointly taking those questions. And if there aren't too many, we'll have a good conversation between the two of us, which is always fruitful too. So let me move along then. I'm going to move along fairly quickly with a few things early on so I can spend a little bit more time, I hope, along the way. First off, I just want to reflect on something that is always really central to my thinking about this topic of the future in our businesses. And that is how easy it is for us to both become overwhelmed in the moment with how much is going on, but also to kind of be over ambitious in what we try to do short term, and lose sight of the fact of just how much we can accomplish long term. This dynamic of trying to be practical and taking reasonable next steps, but also never underestimating what we could do in the future, to me, is so critical in what we think about moving ahead at this point. I do want to acknowledge that a lot of my comments are going to be kind of Alaska centric, just because that's where I'm at, that's the work I'm doing. But I'm trying, and I hope you see also that the intent here is to look a little more broadly at not only circumpolar Arctic issues, but also the national contribution that Alaska can make to our country and to some of the global issues that face many other parts of the world with shared problems that we have at the same time. So I want to back up just a little bit. I've been involved in this innovation ecosystem work now for about 7 years. Time is flying by. And as I began that work, I really focused in on the idea of how do we think about the future. And it was helpful to talk about a startup pipeline. That is, Alaska is very pipeline centric. It's basically defines the last 40 years. It's how we think about our finances. It's got many of the great jobs that we've had. And so I've thought about a startup pipeline as a model for thinking about what we do. Plus, I tend to be kind of process oriented, as you'll see in some of the additional slides here. But what I also want to touch on here is that the problems we were facing 7 years ago, as I began talking about this, our overdependence on oil and gas, our economic disconnect, some of the challenges between urban and rural and balancing subsistence and resource development, those problems were there then. And actually, as we talked about in the breakout room, that same paradox and angst was going on back at statehood in the late 50s. And even in the Second Organic Act in 1912, you'll see the same angst going on about what is the future of Alaska? What does it look like? And to what degree is the future of Alaska guided by Alaskans versus the folks that have come here to develop the resources that we have in Alaska. It's a fundamental problem that we've kind of struggled with, and I don't know that it's going to go away quickly, but it does frame what's happening here. With that in mind and the work that was going on, I began looking at the question of, well, how do all these pieces fit together? How do we think about the process of developing the businesses of the future? And again, being kind of a process guy, I wanted to process map this thing out, but it really helped to begin thinking about how do we take the ideas that we think are valuable, turn them into potential business models, guide and support them to become investable plans, and then move them into providing the financing and support through launch that makes them successful. And recognizing that for this process to work, we need to be able to understand and curate the opportunities, we need to be able to develop the talent, and we have to make sure that what we're doing is investable so that the ideas are not just good ideas, but they're ones that matter, that from the standpoint of whether it's public or private investment, that support comes and allows that business to move ahead. So that's led me most recently to this question of what's next, Alaska. And I have found so many people are really energized by the discussions that we have about this. That is not what's next in the case of, right now, how big is a PFD check going to be, but what is next? What is this Alaska that we're working to create? And I would suggest, what is the Arctic that we want to develop over time to do that? Work that I've been looking at and been exposed to, particularly through the Agile Lab at the University of Northern Alabama, begins this kind of discussion with the idea of S-curves. That is, these predictable ways of modeling economic eras for an economy that begin and then accelerate over time and then hit maturity. And their approach to this, and what I would encourage you to think about, is this natural evolution of our business environment and our economic foundation. And I would suggest that Alaska is now at the beginnings of its third economic era. I would generally suggest that Alaska's first economic era has been its longest. It's been that long-standing, successful, subsistence, sustainable life that goes back millennia, that then was largely displaced and significantly impacted by our current dominant economy today, which has largely been natural resource development. And that has gone from pelts to timber to copper to oil to fish. And I would suggest even that tourism is another version of resource development, with the development of people coming here to do that. And I would suggest here, and this is the key point for you to ponder, is that our resource development economic paradigm has hit a level of maturity. As we look ahead, we may have a great fishery one year in one area, but it collapses in another area. We may open one mine when another mine closes. We may harvest some timber in one tract, but then another tract. But I would suggest that there's not a major significant change that will happen. Now, some would argue if we get a natural gas pipeline, that things kind of rock and roll for a little while with that. I'll grant that there's going to be some exceptions, but I would suggest that overall we have reached a level of somewhat maturity in terms of the impact and size of that natural resource extraction level, and that it is time, as we look to the future, to consider the next economic foundation of our state. That is value-added, sustainable, and a global economy in terms of our impact and our contribution. Now, that's easy to say, it's hard work, but I think it's a mental framework to begin talking about where are we going next and what will it contribute in terms of the opportunities in the Arctic and for its people and its communities. So Margot's question, imagine if in 10 years Alaska was a leader in Arctic innovation because of what we did today, what would that look like? I think that's an absolutely essential question to motivate us into looking at what is ahead in our economy And more particularly, I would suggest that it invites us to consider how we manage the impact of the innovation that we can be trying to encourage. And I think that's a key point in managing that. Now, I'm going to kind of have an aside conversation here that's a little more directed towards those of you that are in research or those of you that are guiding research. And I think there's a really important issue here that I don't want to drag, or go into too much detail on, but if we don't talk about this, we're not going to get anything else done. Because so much of what we're interested in doing is converting research and the investment in research into sustainable solutions and potentially into commercializable opportunities, right? And I would submit that we all want that, including the researchers want to see their work have long-term sustainable, significant impact. But here's the issue. I spent 2 years at UAF working on technology management and technology transfer. And what I ran into was a very common conversation with researchers doing really an amazing amount of work and really world-class work. And that is, Kai, I'm doing this research and you're here to try and get me to disclose it and fill out technology disclosures because you want to capture it in terms of trademarks and patents and trade secrets. And, I'm not doing this research in order for it to be commercialized and somebody to go off and be a capitalist and make a bunch of money from this stuff. I'm doing it because I care about it. It's important work. And because I want my work to go into the public domain to be shared because it was paid for with public resources. And so they would say, I don't necessarily, why do I want to, get involved in this commercialization issue? And so what I invite you to consider here are a couple really important questions. One is, should researchers be focused in on IP and technology transfer? And the second question is, should researchers get mixed up and focused on commercialization? And I want to suggest yes and no. First off, while I understand the desire for the results of research, and by results, I want to clarify that I mean both the methods that are developed to conduct the research, new sensors, new algorithms, new tools that bring new life to how the research is done, which in many cases is where some really interesting IP is developed, things like sensors and gliders and whatnot that we've seen, but also the IP that comes from the results. That by being able to think about protecting that intellectual property, to recognizing it, to disclosing it, is in many cases the most important step that you take to that research actually being developed and commercialized or sustained. Because if we take something like one of the water reactor projects that was alluded to earlier today, that technology is amazing, but you know what? That's going to cost tens of millions of dollars for someone to actually turn it into a real thing. And the only way that will ever get developed is if it was captured as intellectual property, potentially with a patent, so that somebody could make the business decision to invest a bunch of money to actually develop it. And if that IP was just simply freely shared public domain, no one's going to take the time and make the investment and take the risk to develop it. The second point is that by protecting intellectual property and managing it, it provides the opportunity for revenue to come back into the research institutions that's not tied to a grant now, that provides the unrestricted funds that allow you to be able to do new work that maybe can become funded by grants and other traditional research funding, but isn't ready for it yet. So I want to suggest that the intent to identify IP, to disclose it, to capture it, and to consider the management of it is absolutely essential to everything we're talking about the last 2 days. If we want to invest in research and we want to somehow capitalize and see that research sustained and brought to the benefit of the full public good by being able to invest in it. The second point here that I ran into at the university is too often there's we conflate the value of research with the innovation and the entrepreneurial commercialization of it. And what I observed was too often the idea was, the ethos was created that the research wasn't really valuable unless the researcher helped also see it commercialized. And I want to suggest that that's a mistake. We really want to decouple that expectation. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a lot of researchers that have been very successful in taking their research and advancing it to entrepreneurial status and then to commercialization. But I don't think we should make that the measure of the value of the research. If that research is valuable, and quite frankly, even if the research comes to some result that says, you know, that set of experiments resulted in nothing, that's the purpose of the research. It's to do that search, that exploration, and it should be valued for itself, regardless of whether it has a commercial impact later. And by decoupling those two, we can celebrate and recognize the value of research independent of whether or not it's commercialized. But that also then creates a new expectation that those of us that are managing the flow of intellectual property in these projects need to also provide the support so that those research outcomes have a place to land where they can be evaluated and they potentially can be developed into entrepreneurial and commercial opportunities. So, final point here for the moment, that is, research is going to develop a lot of amazing opportunities, both in the methods and in the results. And we should be seeking ways to capture that and look at it. And if it's something that should just be pushed out into the public domain and made open source, by all means do it. But in some cases, if we look at it and say, this is really valuable, but the only way it will ever be made valuable to the world is if we guide and make it investable, then we need to have the processes to do that. And second is to encourage researchers to do good research and not lose or pay an opportunity cost of getting sucked into too much commercialization to advance their idea, because they feel like they have to do it because it's not going to get done otherwise, because we really need in many cases for them to get back and stay in the stream of research to continue their good work and what they can create in that. So the picture I've got here is supposed to be an Arctic ground squirrel. This comes out of Barati Medical at UAF. And an example of one of the most important parts of this whole IP disclosure management process. And that is the real value that I found after working in this area for 2 years is not always in any one particular piece of IP. It's the ability to see how IP from a couple different places come together to create something that couldn't happen. In this case, this was work being done to do brain oxygen level scanning with a wireless system that also needed a backpack system. So I got the researcher in Fairbanks hooked up with a startup business in Anchorage that does sewing to be able to create these little backpacks. And together they created something valuable. Got another example of somebody in Fairbanks that was off working in canine nutrition. And unbeknownst to him, somebody else is down in Kodiak working on making dog treats out of fish skins. And we could have been managing those two pieces of IP independently, and I can guarantee you that both of them would not have gone very far. But putting them together, we saw an opportunity to blend them together. This is the whole point of Margot's exercise a little bit ago, was seeing some of these assets and capabilities and having the mechanism to be able to find the connections that allow the value to be realized that comes out of combining multiple activities. Okay, enough said on the researcher side. I could go on, but I think hopefully I've made the point without belaboring it too much. So I want to dive into a little bit into the foundation of innovation economics, and then I want to move into some thoughts about Alaska's ecosystem and what we do to create the businesses of the future. First off, I want to encourage all of you to start thinking about this term innovation economics. It's a newer specialty within the world of economics. It really looks at the question of what is driving the value from innovation and how do we think about it, how do we measure it, how do we encourage it. And I think our economic future depends upon being able to understand the monetization of innovation and all of the benefits that come from it. It also is a field that recognizes how important the government's activities, and in that I would include also the military and the Coast Guard kind of examples we've been looking at, that this investment being made through this research and these projects is really foundational to most of the innovation that actually moves into commercialization. We want to sometimes think of companies like an Apple as being this really innovative company. Well, guess what? They're basically just Margo on steroids, because all they've done is figured out how to go out and grab 2 or 3 other technologies. Many of them were government developed, and they put them together in a new, better way than was done before. Google comes out of government research, GPS, supercomputers. You can see the list here. This comes out of the work that ADAC and those of you that are working on doing foundational research in the Arctic, you're laying this same foundation that's been laid in these other areas that managed will allow other companies like the Googles and the Apples of the world to be able to come out of that work and to grow. And I hope that those are going to be more Alaskan businesses. Now, in terms of economic impact, it's important to also understand that there's kind of 3 flows of money. And this discussion about the future business in Alaska are really about thinking about what are we doing to create a stronger economy for Alaska, for the Arctic, and for our country. And these flows involve first what referred to as good money. That is, where money flows in because people want what you've done, the things that you're exporting, the services, the value that you've done. That's good money. It builds up our economy. The neutral money is what we stir in our own economy when we go to the restaurant and buy something, or we go to a local tailor who maybe makes something for us. That money stirs in the economy, and it's good. We need to increase the velocity of it. And then there's, well, I hate to always call it bad money, but the things where we have to send our money out of state to buy our groceries, to buy our TVs. And our future depends upon thinking about how we create more value-added activities where the world is coming to us for what we have built. And we are realizing the benefit that comes from that activity, and that we have reduced the amount of flow of money out with import substitutions when we can. Now, where does this work happen? This model suggests that there's a civic economy and there's a market economy. And the market economy and the civic economy can't exist without each other. You cannot have good businesses and the future businesses in the Arctic and Alaska if you don't have the civic economy going on around it. We need docks, we need roads, we need good health care, we need good education. Without those, you're not going to attract and retain good businesses. But you also have to have strong, healthy, profitable businesses, because they're the ones that pay for the civic economy. And it's that collaboration that happens in the boundary between the market economy and the civic economy where value is created. And I would suggest that that's the way to think about what's going on with ADAC and the work that's being done here, is you are working at this boundary. And it is the strategies that you employ to connect the market economy and the market players to the civic economy, and in this case, the public agencies, that is the collaborative space for creating new value and new opportunity for people and for the communities in there. Now, as Nolan, I think, mentioned earlier, job creation impact comes from this innovation. The net job creation is coming from scalable new ventures. This is how our country advances. It's how our state advances in the future. And the map for being able to think about how all these pieces come together comes about by really looking at 4 quadrants. And I apologize if some of these slides I know are really busy. Ellie has the deck that I hope she'll share with any of you that are interested in it. So there's some of the weeds in here, so you've got access to it, but I know it's not always great from a PowerPoint on Zoom. But the 4 quadrants here, what's important here for the moment, which is what we need to think about in building this future capacity. We need the brain power. We need the examples like I think Ben Kelly mentioned in terms of his education. We need the innovation and entrepreneurship activities. We need the quality places. But most importantly, at this point in time, we need the new narratives that inspire us and give us confidence into what we can accomplish in the future. If you put those 4 together, we can build the businesses and build the economy that we're after. We've got to have brain power, innovation, the quality places like this conference and like other physical places we can have, and we need a narrative to guide the work that we're doing. Now, entrepreneurship in Alaska to me is an exciting area, and I could go on. Sometimes I feel like I'm more of a cheerleader and an ambassador to entrepreneurship in Alaska. But as I think Nolan had mentioned, also Alaska has created a lot of jobs. We've created more jobs through entrepreneurship and innovation than we've lost in the oil and gas market. And we think about the problem, but we miss talking about the opportunity and investing in that opportunity. And we will fall over ourselves to help, with the natural resource extraction permitting, but we don't always put the same level of effort into what's actually creating the jobs in our economy at this point. We have some amazing opportunities for creating new businesses, and I believe the focus of this, going back to those S curves, will be building on today's economy and creating innovations out of them. Things like what Launch Alaska is doing to support new alternative energies, the work of the Alaska Ocean Cluster that Taylor referred to in the seafood area, and many other examples that are building a new economy, but we're not stepping away and forgetting the existing economy. We're building off of that. Examples of that include companies like Alpine Fit doing base layer work, North Arrow building enclosures for the wellheads on there, Heather's Choice doing outdoor adventure food. We had Ben with the Launch company on there. But two in particular I want to talk about are the McKinnon Marine and Trivarus businesses. And I'm going to skip past that. And other Alaska solutions in there. The one on the left, Arctic Heat Technology, is a solution that was commercialized out of the University of Alaska using carbon fiber to heat sidewalks. And on the right is beaded streams temperature sensors that were mentioned, I think, yesterday by Mead, that represent Alaskan innovation to challenges that we face here, but in both cases, solutions that have application far beyond our own borders. The other piece, going back now to Heather's Choice, is this is not only a business that is commercializing the outdoor adventure food that she's created, but this is also a perfect example of what Alaska can do. This business started off manufacturing locally, and then as it scaled, it decided it had to go out of Alaska to manufacture all of its product. And in fact, that didn't turn out to be the best way to run the business. So she's now manufacturing all this right here in Anchorage by the pallet load and shipping it out, demonstrating, and I've got lots of stories I could give you on the fact that Alaska is actually a competitive place to do business. We do manufacture here, and it is more competitive to do it here than it is to do it out of state. McKinnon Marine is a local business that started off manufacturing a high-performance personal watercraft for going up glacial streams. But it turns out the big market for it is in the public sector. These are now being sold to the Department of Homeland Security for doing border security in the lower 48. They're being sold on the East Coast and the West Coast for search and rescue operations in swiftwater and floodwater type applications. And around Alaska, you'll find them now being used by the VPSO, Village Safety Patrol officers, for helping them patrol coastal communities, including a couple of versions now that have been made into local fire boats for rapid response in water-related areas. The other business, Trivarus, that some of you are familiar with, is manufacturing deck cleaning equipment for the Air Force, as well as dual-use commercial application for cleaning in other terrestrial applications on here. In both cases, these products were designed in Alaska. They're being made in Alaska. And in both cases, the companies had considered moving the operations out of Alaska because folks kept telling them they needed to be out of Alaska to be able to produce these products. And in both cases, the businesses came back and said, you know what? Alaska is the most competitive place for us to build these products. Even though in the case these deck machines are being sold to aircraft carriers, in the lower 48 that then travel the world, and the same with the boats that we're making at this point. Last example for the moment is this new Department of Energy Arctic Innovation Fellows Program that is being led by Nathan Prisco. He is working uniquely right now on how to take our current assets in terms of natural gas and turn them into ammonia. And when this first came up, I thought, well, why does Alaska need more ammonia, right? We already closed the plant down in Nikiski. And you know, doesn't the world already have enough fertilizer? And it was shocking to me to realize what I didn't know about the hydrogen economy and about the opportunity that we have in Alaska for carbon sequestration to be able to create blue ammonia fuel on the North Slope, push the carbon dioxide back in the ground so we still maintain reservoir pressures, and put the ammonia in the Trans-Alaska pipeline and ship it down and extract it. And in the next 30 years, maritime fleets and folks in Korea and Japan are converting their current power generation systems over to burning ammonia. And we're sitting on top of this amazing resource for the next generation of hydrogen clean energy for our world at this point. So final bit of rah-rah, and then I'm going to get into some specifics about what do we do next. Folks don't always know what's going on in the Alaska ecosystem. We have, a few years ago, the national winner of Kauffman Foundation's 1 in a Million competition. An Alaska company that came out of Startup Weekend won that, Pandair Shoes. We have 2 years ago, the Circumpolar Young Entrepreneur of the Year award given to Piper Foster Wilder, an Alaskan working on 60 Hertz here. We have about 5 years ago, the National Future Farmers of America Entrepreneur of the Year Award, national, out of Alaska, Cameron and Vertical Harvest. We have the company that won the Alaska Airlines Environmental Water Challenge, I think last year, came out of Alaska, a finalist in the MIT Environmental Challenge out of Alaska. And you've got other examples of situations like the launch company with Ben. Alaska has award-winning entrepreneurs here. These are world-class individuals. We're not a wannabe innovation ecosystem that would like to become something. We're already doing it. We are so far outsized in our impact for our population. We should be dazzled and surprised at what's going on here. We have some amazing entrepreneurial ecosystem organizations. Center Ice up in Fairbanks. You've got the Center for Economic Development down here in Anchorage, the Health Tie organization working nationwide in the area of healthcare innovations, Launch Alaska working internationally in the area of energy transformations. These are world-class organizations working in ecosystem development. And finally, we've got globally competitive businesses. Companies like Trivarus and their partner company Trijet, when some of that work being done was going to get moved out of Alaska, so the manufacturing, one of the things that folks out of Alaska realized was that Alaska's capability was actually the best they could have. There were parts that were being made that were getting resourced to China. And once they actually looked at how competitive the work could be done in Alaska, it didn't go to China. The work stayed in Alaska. Now we've got multiple examples of where people think they've got to go out of Alaska, but they find out that this is the place to be, just like Ben Kelly and Launch Alaska, or excuse me, the launch company, and companies like McKinnon Marine and Trivarus. We have great entrepreneurs, we have the organizational support systems, we have the companies that are globally competitive. So what stands in our way? I think it's mindset. I don't think we all know this. I don't think we know what we're capable of. I don't know that we know what we're doing. And I don't think that we have integrated our activities to be able to help guide this good work forward and to leverage it. When I was in Serbia as an entrepreneur in residence, I was so blown away. Here I was in Serbia, and the folks in Serbia believed that they were too far away from any markets, that the local market was too small for them to be successful. And this blew my mind. Here's this country that's got, you know, a couple million people in it, and between the distance from Belgrade to the equivalent distance from Belgrade out, which would be Anchorage to Seattle, right, our next closest economic base, that same radius is what you see on this chart here. They've got 1.4 billion people in the distance from Anchorage to Seattle that they could access. And they believed that their market was too small and they were too remote. Well, You know, I spent a couple months there, and I basically just had to keep kind of reminding them, guys, it's mindset that's blocking you from being successful. It's not your location, it's not your capability, it's not your brain power. I mean, Alaska's dark. Well, yeah, it's dark. When I lived in San Diego, it was dark when I went to work in the morning. It was dark when I came home. So don't tell me about dark. Alaska's cold. Yeah, it's cold, but geez, how many of you have been in Chicago in the winter when the wind is blowing off the lake? You want to talk about cold? That's cold too. Transportation. When I lived in Portland, you know, it drove me nuts. I had to hop on an airplane. It was a 3-hour plane flight to get to Chicago. Why am I supposed to think that flying from Anchorage 3 hours to Seattle is some sort of problem when I would do it any day of the week to fly from Portland to Chicago? Come on. We're not that far away in this day and age. We've got the resources and cost of living. I mean, go look at the numbers here, depending on how you do it. Anchorage is not that scary of a place to be in terms of cost of living. It's way down the list now in terms of overall cost of living, including rent. And if you compare it with our salaries, it's even lower down the list. Yeah, we've got barriers, we've got challenges, but you know what? The rest of the world's got them too. You want to talk about finding people to employ? Go down to Seattle or Portland, and you think they have an easy time hiring folks for their jobs? Yes, if you're here in Anchorage, you can say, well, gosh, where are you going to find programmers? Well, you know what? Go down to Portland and ask a Portland company if they're having trouble finding programmers. They're having the same trouble. So our obstacles are mostly excuses. They're a mindset that I hope will change. Okay, I need to zoom along now. As we look ahead, I think it's really important to understand the global context of the work that we're doing. We are making this change from a resource extraction based type of economy, and many of the folks that are working in this area now are encouraging us to think about a regenerative development phase, and the UN strategic sustainable development goals really are an important framework for what we do. We've heard these already in the last couple of days in terms of the importance on local community, subsistence lifestyle, people, and impacts. We need to be bringing in this global mindset of sustainability, just transitions, regenerative type innovation in the work that we're going to do in the future. So there's two fundamental questions that always come up looking at the future and strategic planning, and they're the only two questions that ever matter. Where are we going and how do we get there? And that's what I want to try and dive into now to finish up here. And I'm going to skip past it when I thought it was turned off. So here's our current paradigm for innovation ecosystems and startup communities. Our current paradigm puts emerging businesses over on the side, and we've got this nice little overlap between existing businesses, our public agencies and government, and that would include the military, and our education system. And I want to suggest that moving ahead, that paradigm must change. We need to move into this notion of open innovation ecosystems. And what that looks like is a system where those emerging businesses are shifted over into and aligned with the public, private, and educational systems, and that green area in the middle becomes the place where we work together, where we link and leverage and collaborate to be able to identify what we can work on and how to work together, where you have the risk-taking capacity of startups married together with the more conservative public agencies with fiduciary responsibilities, and they work together to solve problems. And they are, as Michael Weiss says in a new book I'll reference later, we need to have a lot more bad ideas. We need to create a space where innovation, in order to create the next best, really amazing idea, has to go through a lot more bad ideas to get there. And if we don't have that space, we won't get there down the road. So one of two models that I think are the path forward for us. First off is this impact innovation model. And this is the piece where I think Alaska's gap is right now in its path forward. It doesn't have a way to connect these pieces here. And you know, the slides will be available if you want to read the details. I know they're really small here, but here's the point. There's four main areas that need to be managed. We have to be able to explore the challenges that exist. Now, challenges in some cases might be a problem, But challenges in other cases might be an incredible new technology or resource or asset that's underutilized. But we have to have a process to explore those challenges, to curate them, to do the research in those areas, and then we need to connect them and turn them into opportunities and curate those and manage an opportunity space where we look at the impact and the effort to develop opportunities and to then move those over into new solutions and developing those innovations that eventually become then sustainable ventures that have impact. Building a system to connect challenges to opportunities, to innovations, to ventures is an essential strategic pathway that needs to be built. Right now, I would suggest we've got lots of great things going on, but they're all a series of independent silos that are not connected, and we're not helping move things through that process effectively. A key notion within this process is the feedback that goes on. We have to be able to explore the challenges. We need to be able to work on the opportunities, and we need to be able to look at the samples knowing that it's okay for some of those sample solutions to fail, but it's not a failure if we learn from them. If what happens is that feeds back into a better understanding of the opportunity space and the impacts and the efforts that we could then expend in the future. The second piece of this model is understanding the pathway of moving ideas and ventures forward. And that is a pathway of being able to go from the ideas to a business model, to the business strategy, to the plan, to the financing, and the launch. And there's more pieces of this puzzle here, but it is a process. It needs to be connected. And when we do that, we have the ability to increase the velocity of new ideas being tested and made investable. So wrapping up here, future of business in the Arctic. I'm not sure, if folks wanted me to be a futurist here. I'm not going to be a futurist. I'm going to say that the future of the business in the Arctic is built upon what we're doing now. We need to have confidence in what we're doing, and we need to see the potential of building this into a new economic paradigm for a state. One of the things that distinguishes our innovation ecosystem is it's practical. When I compare what was going on here to Austin or Silicon Valley or even Seattle and Portland, what we're doing here is real. It has value. It impacts people's lives. It's solving real problems. And I think that's a strength for our business innovation ecosystem. But the problems here are not unique to the Arctic. They're not unique to Alaska. The problems that we can solve here, whether it's coastal erosion, transportation challenges, energy transitions, climate change, these are all global challenges. Our ability to go from a challenge to opportunity to an innovation to a venture creates the opportunity for those ventures to have global impact in the solutions that they provide. We do need to look at value-added resources and how we add value to the resources we have. We need to work through the challenges right now of climate change, energy transitions, food security, but we also have these amazing opportunities we've talked about in the last couple of days in communications and logistics on top of that. Next steps. Bottom line here, these are the issues I think are where we will build the businesses of the future and where we will leverage the investment being made in the Arctic and the research and the operations that are developing there. We need to coordinate the impact of our innovations. That process needs to be tied together. Second is we need to be able to manage that innovation stack. We have to be able to take those ideas from modeling to strategy to plans to financing to launch. We need an IP management plan that looks at the portfolio, looks at the tech transfer, curates them, but also realizes that the IP should never be looked at as independent little silos. We've got to link and leverage these different pieces of IP and figure out how they connect up, just like the exercise we did before this, to look for the hidden assets that we didn't realize are there, but actually have value someplace. We do have to deal with investment funds and rebuilding the Alaska Seed Fund, work going on at UAF right now. We need to clarify strategic initiatives. We need to also recognize we're spending billions in this state. We have got to connect up the projects that we're going to do anyway to the investments in those projects that create innovations. If we're going to move a village a couple miles and spend a couple $100 million on it, we ought to be thinking about how does that create new sustainable ventures out of that. If we're going to spend $1 billion or $2 billion on a port project, we ought to be thinking about how do we create a legacy infrastructure in the process, not just simply check off the success of these projects having been contracted. We need to build that map I mentioned, quality places, innovation, brainpower narrative, and we need to have policies that look at this long view, this new economy that's coming out. Some resources in the slide deck I would encourage you to look at if you're interested in some of the foundational pieces of this thinking I've gone over here. And I want to bring you back to what's next, Alaska? What's the future going to look like? Will this be a place where we just simply tweak and maximize the remaining extraction industry? Or will we bring more people that come from an Alaska community, that go to Alaska school, they go off and they go launching rockets to space, and they come back and land in Alaska for their future? So I appreciate the time that we've had today, and look forward to hopefully any limited amount of time for questions. I know I always talk more than I wish I did, but I love this opportunity, and I'm so appreciative to ADAC for the opportunity to share some of this work I'm doing, and look forward to more collaborations in the future. Thanks.
The text question that came in was focused on the following. Kai, thank you for an outstanding set of reflections. When we look to the future, is there any particular sector that Alaska holds a unique advantage in the Arctic region in order to develop, to bring education and industry together? But is there any particular sector that you would cue innovators and entrepreneurs and academics together to really focus on?
You know, first off, thanks for your comments. You know, I appreciate you could listen to me longer. I guarantee you I could talk a lot longer. I always have to try and rein it in. So, you know, that's hard for me to nail down. I would suggest two areas in particular. One is, I think the energy transition area is a really valuable one because it's a very practical one for our state. What I look for are creating innovation ecosystems where there's a natural pull to the innovation, where we're not just simply doing something because it's fun, interesting, or exciting, but where there's real value. When you look at the cost of energy in remote locations right now and the reliance on diesel fuel, for example, in many of our villages, that right now is a heavy weight on a lot of our development costs for resources, remote locations. It's a heavy weight on our communities. And I think the investment in microgrid technologies, alternative energies, is one that is really right for Alaska to lead the world on something it needs anyway. This microgrid technology is not just about Arctic or Alaska. And I think if we can solve that one, it has this pull because we're already spending the money in this area. We're already seeing the cost of this expense. The second area is in the same vein. Again, a pull system in there in the area of healthcare and healthcare innovations. We're spending a tremendous amount in this state. We lead the world on, or excuse me, the country in the cost of our healthcare. We're already spending the money. It's right for us to spend the money in innovation and reap the benefit that comes out of that. Many other examples, but I would encourage you to generally think about that question from the perspective of where are there natural existing flows of money that could be pivoted in order to develop valuable returns on that pivot, that exchange to create innovations that will help our state, our Arctic area development, and create this, what I refer to as kind of a virtuous cycle of improvement. This virtuous cycle where some investments in innovation cause us to start saving some money, our economy, our people, our communities are a little stronger, so they can invest a little bit more, so they get better. Deming was a master at clarifying the value that comes from creating virtuous cycles of improvement and reversing the vicious cycles down where cuts end up with more cuts that make it less possible to do anything, so you have to cut more. So look for the pulls in terms of opportunity. I think they're all over the place. I just mentioned two, but I want to illustrate the way of thinking about how to choose those areas. And we don't need to go after the speculative ones. Go for where we're spending money and figure out how to leverage that. I have been a big advocate nationally of this idea of spending 2% for innovation. I would love to carve out 2% of every disaster funding that comes into our state for innovation, 2% for large capital projects, to get this engine going of how do we take 2% of this spending and turn it into transformative innovation with an impact. Told you I could talk.
That's
Okay.
simply outstanding. I just want to say thank you for that. I'll give the floor back to Ellie. There is one comment though that did come in while you're, and you may be out of time, but this, you mentioned, Kai, a discussion about how to get researchers to share their IP, then get back to research, allow the innovators to take it forward from there. Do you have an example of what that looks like in a successful light?
Yeah, so two examples briefly. One is, and again, I want to be cautious about one with UAF with this water cleaning technology because there's a lot of people in play. But that one was an example where the primary researcher scientist disclosed it, created the IP, turned into a patent, and is now being led by another community entrepreneur who had experience in doing technology development. And that combination is allowing that to then develop a network with other researchers and scientists to develop that technology. The other example of that is out of Utah. They've got a wonderful program where they have students that review all of the IP disclosures, and they then identify key new IP that's really interesting, and they then spend a couple semesters working on the business plans, and frequently they then take that idea and commercialize it and move ahead with it by virtue of having had the opportunity to engage in it and explore that technology and develop a business plan out of it. So other areas, but those are two examples of where it's working, and it is through that process that it works. Where I've seen researchers just kind of stick at it over time without reaching out and collaborating or transferring it like that, it tends to kind of jiggle in the bowl of jello. It's a lot of good activity, but not the results we'd like to see.
Well, I'll jump in here really quickly. I apologize if my furry colleague is also giving you a standing ovation right now in the background. I have a quick question that I think I can pose to both Margot and Kai that pulls together a couple of the threads that you posed during your presentation, Kai. And one of them, they're interrelated. One of them is that entrepreneurs and innovators often find, or at least there's this mindset that you highlighted, that they have to leave the state to become successful. I also think that that can coincide with, at least growing up here in Anchorage, I think I grew up surrounded by a mindset that you often have to leave the state to get an education elsewhere. And with that, a number of presentations today, especially from Alaska-centric folks, highlighted that a lot of people, especially students that leave the state, often don't come back. And I know I kind of fall in one of those categories that I also continue to leave the state for education. And fortunately, I have found myself back here, but I was kind of the minority amongst a lot of people in my age group and class. And so with that, I wonder, combining those two ideas, I think mindset is a complicated thing to change. It might be easier to change an individual mindset, but it seems like there's kind of a community-wide mindset that success is often found elsewhere if you're a young person growing up here. So I wonder how you might pose, even if there's a number of ways, either of you, to change that mindset, especially among young people.
Yeah. Well, I'll be brief because I'm curious about Margot's. So I left the state. I was gone for 20 years and came back. So I resemble, that issue. But, first off, I don't want to begin discouraging Alaskans from going out of state to go to school. There are amazing schools out there, amazing opportunities. I'm so impressed with what Iceland does, where they basically send all of their young people and basically pay for them to go out and say, go someplace else to get educated, because it brings back people that have that world global view, experience, and connections is valuable. So yes, I want folks to go to school here if they can and they want to, but yes, I also want them to go out and aspire. But here's the magic of this. I want us to build companies here in Alaska. So an Alaskan that's going through high school is motivated and thinks about, I want to get the very best grades I can in high school because I want to go to the very best school I can go to in the world, because I want to be the top candidate for the job in the business that's in Alaska. Because we have the kind of a businesses that would attract someone to be here, and they will go off and do their best, that they will aspire to do their best because they want to be a part of what's going on. I would submit that what you see with Ben and the launch company is an example where somebody would be motivated to do well in high school, do well in Rock Tree Coast, be motivated to go off to the best school in the world on Rock Tree, because they would want that opportunity to work for that company. We need to think that way. Margot, what do you think?
I agree. And so I grew up here. I went to UAF. I also left for a few years. And one thing that we have found, the more entrepreneurship education we do, the more there's a larger need for it. We have so many fantastic students that have no idea what entrepreneurship is in reality. It's not normalized for them. Right. So to them, they think, well, I'm not an engineer. Why would I have a startup? I don't build things. Well, I'm like, you could be a fantastic data specialist, or you could be a designer. You know, you could have a variety of different backgrounds, and normalizing what that looks like and how they could potentially find great success right here at home, and helping them redefine what success looks like. Because I think that oftentimes people think, well, I won't make the kind of money that I would want, or I wouldn't have a job, you know, that I would want. And so when we tell them, why don't you create that job or that startup here, it's often a deer in the headlights look. So a big push for us is, how do we normalize what that is? Because we find often people are like, I did not know this was an opportunity for me. And now that it is, oh my God, I'm so excited. But until that becomes normalized for a lot of our even K-12 education all the way up through the university, people won't know that's an opportunity. So that's what I would say.